Hello, students. Welcome to our discussion on notes and reading research articles. So this information is really useful for taking notes on things like the textbook as well as research articles. So hopefully you find this really useful for all of your classes. I usually share this for specifically the question paper or research paper assignments or like annotated bibliographies, things like that, for how to read research articles and how to take notes. But it is really applicable and you can use it for all of your classes. With that being said, let's jump into this. One thing that I definitely recommend is handwriting your notes. So there's a study linked here at the bottom. You can search that up or just kind of type in that DOI on your own device if you want to read this. But essentially, this review of a bunch of different research over the past 15, 20 years looks at brain scans of people who are taking notes by hand versus taking notes by typing. And I'll be honest, I do a lot of my note taking by typing, but I do know, especially for someone in early career of academia, if you're in like a 100, 200 level class, handwriting your notes is very helpful for a lot of different reasons. So one of the main reasons that handwriting your notes is so good is because it uses so many more brain areas. And hopefully in your class, we've talked a little bit about neurons and neuron connections. Essentially, here is the brain areas that are used when handwriting. Obviously, something like the actual motor area of using your hand to write is being used. But there's things in your prefrontal cortex that are used more heavily for planning out what you're going to write. Very often when we are typing notes, a lot of people, not everybody, a lot of people though, try to type almost everything that's being said, or most of everything. They're not kind of discerning and planning out what is most important. What might I need to know in the future? How is the best way to explain this in a short way? So that is what we're using our brain for when we are handwriting. We're not able to write down everything, absolutely everything, so we have to pick and choose exactly what we write and how we write it down in our notes. So that is one of the main reasons handwriting is so good. It's because we are being more discerning in like what we're putting into our notes. We're putting things that we're like, oh yeah, I definitely need, say, that definition, or I definitely need a good explanation or a good summary of this, or oh, I thought of this example that's connected to my life. Anything that's more personally connected to something you already know, your own life, things that you already remember from other classes, those are going to be good things to put in your notes and a good way to connect with your memory. And the big idea about, well, why does it matter that you're using more brain areas is because memories are just networks of neurons. So you will remember more because you have more connections to that network. So you'll be able to trigger the memory of what you learned, what you wrote down, what you're taking notes on when more easily when you have more networks connected to it. So here is a picture of axons in the brain. So it's actually doesn't have the cerebellum, the little wrinkly portion back here at the very back, but that's okay. Here's the prefrontal cortex. You can see a lot of the axons that are coming back here, even wrapping all the way around. So axons have a lot of connections, and you can think of any given memory of learning something in a research paper, learning something in a book, learning something in class as activating a bunch of neurons across your whole brain. And so that memory is actually some of those neurons. So it's about like 5, maybe 10% of those neurons that were most active at the time it happened that are part of your memory. You actually reactivate some of those same neurons. And that's how we make memories, by making brain networks. So because handwriting uses more brain areas and it uses more areas specifically connected to memory, it's a lot better at putting that stuff into your brain. Also, handwriting takes that more cognitive energy, which also in addition improves your memory. So I recommend handwriting your notes whenever possible. There are devices where you can handwrite notes and it will scan it into a searchable document. That can be cool, but it's expensive. I usually use paper notes for important meetings. Yeah, it can be less distracting. It's also easier to focus and not get distracted by, say, an email notification that comes in. I know there's times when I'm trying to say grade or something, and I'm like, oh, I've got to finish this class. And then an email notification suddenly come in. I get distracted. That can still happen, obviously, if you've got notifications going on around you. But if you're focused on handwriting your notes, you're using that cognitive energy, you're using those more areas of your brain, you're going to do a better job at putting together those networks to make memory connections. So that's really why handwriting is better than typing your notes. So that being said, again, I do sometimes type my notes. It is faster, tends to be more efficient to type notes. And so that can be really useful depending on your goal. If I'm in a meeting where I know it's not really essential information that I'm absolutely going to have to remember, that I just have to kind of make note of a few key things through the meeting of like, what am I supposed to do outside of this meeting? That might be a good time to do typing of my notes. But if it's something like a research conference where there's going to be really important new data or information that I really want to remember, I'm going to be handwriting that. So I just did that at a research conference last month. So I hope this makes it clear. I hope you write your notes legibly. If you have a note-taking assignment that's by hand, I hope it's this legible. You might fill it in more, but this is a good example of maybe how dense your notes should be after you've read the textbook a first time before coming to class. And then after you come to class, you can even add into these. You can add into the gaps some additional examples or things like that. So, but if you have an assignment, I want to be able to read it, to be able to see what you're actually writing. Feel free to write in cursive, not in cursive, whatever you want, but I do need to be able to read it if it's an assignment for you. All right, so let's talk about how to take notes. So how we take notes, the main way is one, paraphrasing. So paraphrasing is a challenge for a lot of early students. They might not be used to it yet. So paraphrasing is basically putting the research into your own words. So you read these couple sentences, you read this paragraph. Now, how do I put this in my own words into my notes and then into my paper? Well, it's very similar to just talking to someone about it. How would you then explain that to someone else? So here's an example, and I'll go over the section of the document later on in this presentation where this came from. But essentially, there's this paragraph, and it's talking about handwriting versus typing. And the main point was that handwriting activates more memory connection networks than typing notes. So while there was a whole paragraph that kind of talked about specific data about that, that was the main takeaway point. So I paraphrased it. I put it in my own words. Honestly, that was also all I cared about. If I cared more about like some of the specific studies, I might have taken note on specific studies, but this is what I cared about. That handwriting activates more memory networks than typing notes. So that was my note. That was my paraphrase. I put that in my own words. There wasn't a specific sentence that said that outright. There were multiple sentences that made that point, essentially. So aim to write the ideas from your sources in new ways. It should be different from the original source. So don't just rearrange the sentence. Don't just change one or two words in the sentence. That's not actually paraphrasing. It's called patch writing, and it is actually a form of plagiarism. So, and sometimes plagiarism catchers can still catch that. So rather than that, put those things in your own words. I want you to be thinking about the things you're reading, whether it's in a chapter, but especially a research article, and then explaining it the best that you can. That's part of this critical thinking that we're building and testing out. So with that, when you're paraphrasing, write clearly and concisely, restate it in your own words, describe what you learned from the material. So you just read this paragraph, you just read this sentence, you read this whole page or a whole section of a paper. What did you take away? If it's a whole section of a paper, maybe there's 2 or 3 or 4 main points that you took away from your reading. So with that, don't patch write. Again, that's just changing a couple words in the sentence, rearranging things a little bit, like patching it together so it doesn't look exactly the same as the original author. That's not actually paraphrasing. So here are some examples on the Purdue's OWL website. So OWL is Online Writing Lab. Purdue is a university. So feel free to go to Purdue OWL for a lot of guidance for APA writing, MLA writing, and another class. But for our class, APA. So here is the original passage right here. And I won't actually read it for you, but this is an example of a plagiarized version. So they essentially took the same thing, but they didn't give it any citations. There's no credit to the original author. That is an example of plagiarism. So now we'll look at that original passage and a paraphrase. So you can read the differences here. You can pause the video and read that. And also another summary. So both of these down here are good ways to describe the findings from this original passage. And you can see in both, this is not APA format because the Purdue OWL example was MLA, but it's totally fine. They are citing the work. So hopefully this gives you an example of how to paraphrase. You're putting the ideas in your own words. It's not the same sentences with just a couple words taken away. The more that you can describe it as you understand it, the better. So here's that example that I described earlier. Here is a whole paragraph in the paper on that systematic review of research on brain scans from people handwriting versus typing notes. So you can read this whole thing, and this sentence is pretty similar to what I wrote here, but it's really this whole section is the idea that handwriting activates more memory connection networks than typing notes. So feel free to pause. You can read through the whole thing and get an idea. But if I was describing to students or writing it in a research paper, this is what I would write. This is what I put in my notes. This is actually a note-taking program for research articles on the computer. But this is what you would put in your handwritten notes. So that is also a sentence that I might write in my actual research paper and then put the citation of where this came from. So hopefully that gives you a couple good examples of actual paraphrasing and putting things into your own words. So with that, how to take notes? Well, here are a couple tips. So these come from a couple different articles, a couple different books. And so essentially, these are the main points over here. I want you to say, read this as an example. If you want to practice this, you can read this and then spend time with it. Reread it. If there's some parts of it that you don't understand, try rereading it again. So this is a good paragraph that you could try to do that with. But again, the most important thing is to do this in your own work. If you read a sentence, read a paragraph, and you're not sure what it was saying, try rereading it before just skipping on. Try to comprehend it. Try to pick the words apart. There might be new things. You might not know what, say, postulate or humanistic psychology is, so you could look those things up. With that, spend a little time with it. I think you can understand this passage. But again, with a lot of your research, you can probably understand a lot of it. So reread, read and reread, spend time with it. Another good tip is that sometimes, especially at 100 and 200 level classes, you might not need specific information. So depending on your level, some of it might be fine to skip. So here, do you care about these specific brain areas in this section of the paper? Is that important to your project? Is knowing the frontoparietal network or the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex are a part of this process? Well, it might not be. You might not need that much detail to put in your notes. When you're reading this, you might just read it and kind of skip this or like skim this and say, okay, so this is saying working memory uses these brain areas. And for my research, for my point, I don't care what brain areas they are for my paper, but just that working memory uses brain areas is how I would kind of summarize this. Or executive, the central executive in working memory uses these brain areas. That's totally fine. That's a very valid way to read and skim this part of the paper because this might not be important to you. It depends on what your topic is. It depends on what you're trying to do. Don't just assume you can skip. If it is something you find important, reread, but sometimes you can skip. One thing I would recommend for most of my students, especially if you're in my 100 and 200 level classes, probably skip anything that is in the methods and results sections. So here's an example of part of a results section. This is from one of my results sections. So I wrote this, I know what this means, but if you're a student at a 100 and 200 level class, do you have any idea what these numbers mean? No, it's probably just gibberish. If you've been in some advanced stats classes or even some basic stats classes, honestly, you might understand it. But for most of your papers, it's not going to be important. So feel free to skip, for most of you, the methods and results sections. Discussion sections in a paper often talk about these same results, just in more plain language. So you might be able to skip some specifics in a paper, but you can almost certainly, especially in 100, 200 level classes, skip the math part of the papers. So feel free just to ignore those. So with this, as you're taking notes, how do you do it? Well, ask yourself questions. Ask yourself something like, can I summarize the meaning of this in my own words? So, what's clear to me? What needs to be clarified? So, what do I understand? What don't I understand? And can I connect these ideas with other things I already know? So, if it's something that you're like, oh, this reminds me of something that I learned in biology class or my philosophy class, write that in your notes. Those are really great ways to take notes. Other things, you can highlight sentences. So you can do that on a physical copy of your research article. You could do that through online programs, but highlight those things that are most useful. Oftentimes, for research articles that I've read previously, I have them saved and highlighted. I will actually basically skim through, barely reading anything except for the highlighted portions. Because I've read this before, I knew this was important or a critical piece. Now, there might be things in there that now that I know more or I'm working on a different project, I might want to come back to. But those highlights can really help you highlight specific facts or points. So, also as you read through anything that's specifically of interest to your project. So again, if those specific brain areas was relevant to your project, you want to focus on it. If those brain areas aren't relevant to your project, then you can ignore them or kind of skim over them and say, okay, so this is the brain areas that are related to this process. That's fine. So essentially, try to retain the info that's most relevant to you, whether it's studying for a class, for a test, whether it is for researching a paper. Maybe you have a specific topic that you want to learn about. Well, a research paper might talk about that topic and other topics. So you can maybe skim some of the other pieces and focus on the stuff that's interesting to you and kind of dump the rest. So you don't even have to take notes on it necessarily. So sometimes you will have direct quotes in your notes. So that can be good if you plan to use that direct quote in your paper. But with this, only include that if you think it's the best way to describe or define something. Most of your research papers that I'm looking for are paraphrasing. You talking about the research in your own words. What do you understand now? How did you put the ideas from multiple research papers together? How do you understand this concept in your own words? That's mostly what I'm looking for. But for things like definitions or really clear descriptions, you might want to put quotes into your notes, but usually you don't need those quotes. So again, here is an example of that paragraph talking about handwriting versus typing. And it's again, just an example of all of the points in the paper, but this whole section is really just talking about how memory networks are more connected when handwriting than typing notes. So this is my note on essentially this whole paragraph as an example. So with that, I'll jump to reading a research article. Hopefully that gives you a lot of good suggestions and tips for what to do when you're trying to take notes. I'll kind of skim through some of the main points again. One is focus on the things that are most important to your project. Reread sections that you think might be a little difficult. If it is a big section that's not super relevant, well, you can kind of skim that area, put it together in a chunk. So like working memory uses these brain areas. And for some of the stats, you can probably skip them at my 100 level classes. Ask yourself questions like, how can you summarize this? What is clear? What is connected to things I already know? What are examples I thought of while reading it? And then highlighting can be really useful, especially to look for specific things that are of interest to you for your paper or what you're wanting to learn. So going ahead, how do you read a research article? Well, here is the first page of a research article. You've got the title, you've got the authors, you've got the DOI. Usually the DOI is going to be on like the first or second page. So if you're looking for that, and then it's got also the journal, things like that. Then it has this section of abstract. Sometimes the abstract won't actually be labeled, but generally it's kind of a smaller block of text. It might be a smaller font size, kind of separate from the rest of the writing, and it's usually one of the first things that you see on the paper. That is the abstract. So an abstract is a summary of the article written by the author. So it's a good way to know as you're trying to find research if this is going to be a useful paper. It should summarize kind of why they did the study, what study they did, and then what were their main findings, what does it mean. So with that, you might also find keywords whether it's in the abstract or below. A lot of papers will have keywords, and that can help you in your searching too. If you want to find more research on one of these topics, maybe you had never heard of prudence before and you wanted to research that or something, you can include that keyword in a future search. So abstracts are a great place to start reading, and it's a great place to decide, should I keep this article or do I not need this one? Is it not going to answer my question? Next is the introduction. So the introduction is basically the next thing after the abstract. Sometimes you will find research papers do not actually label the introduction, and that's totally fine. But for a lot of my 100, 200 level classes, a lot of the information that you want to learn is going to be in the introduction, because the introduction is basically the description of, well, why did this author or authors do this research? What is the history of research in this area? So a lot of times you'll find what you're wanting for your papers in the introduction. So I definitely recommend reading the entire introduction. Again, it should be the next thing after the abstract. All right, the next piece is the methods. Methods is essentially, what methods did the researcher use to do the study? How did they do the study? Did they do experiments? Did they use surveys? Did they use surveys and experiments? Did they watch people in a park, right? So how did they actually do it? They'll have their samples, the study descriptions. It should be really descriptive enough that another researcher could redo the study if they wanted to. And that's the main goal, is to make it clear to other scientists, how did I do this research? So you can judge, did I do a good job? Is this relevant to my population? And so the only reason that I think my 100 and 200 level students should care about a methods section is if you specifically are looking for a very specific population to learn about. Let's say you want to see just research about First Nations people or Indigenous people to the Olympic Peninsula. Well, you would look in the methods sections for where did they get their sample. If they got their sample from Nebraska and the indigenous people there, then you probably won't want to read that, right? And there might still be some good stuff in the intro though. But that might suggest, oh, this isn't actually the focused population that I was wanting to research, right? So if you were just looking at women's diagnosis of ADHD or autism, and you find in the methods that it's actually mostly men in the sample, you might decide, well, are they comparing? Might there still be something useful? But that's basically all you would need to use the methods for. I would recommend for most of my students in 100 and 200 level classes to just skip the methods section. If I ask you to print out articles and bring them to class, you don't even probably, I mean, listen to my instructions in class. This might change varying on the class, but probably you can just skip printing those methods pages. Similarly, the results, you can probably entirely skip that. For my 100 and 200 level classes, the results is what happened. What are the math? What is the stats? What are the math results? So what is the mean pre-score versus the post-test score? And then what is the significance test to that? If none of that made sense to you, that's totally fine. That's why I don't care if you read the results at my 100, 200 level classes. It's the math of what happened. And it's very important for researchers to look at this math and say, okay, so this worked, this didn't work. But the nice thing about research articles is the discussion kind of talks about what the results mean. And it's usually in more plain language. So certain authors are better at writing than other authors. But this is essentially where you say, okay, this is what the results mean in normal language. There is how it correlates to the research we talked about in the introduction, how it's related to the history of the field. And so for students, especially in my 100, 200 level classes, there's going to be a lot of useful info here in the discussion for you. So I definitely recommend you read the whole discussion. Sometimes there will be a conclusion labeled, but also the last paragraph might be the conclusion and just not be labeled as conclusion. And so that's kind of the tie up. Like, these are some of the main points. This is maybe areas where the study was weak or future things that need to be done. But the discussion is taking the math results and saying, this is what it actually means. This is how it relates to other research that was done in the past. So thinking about, oh, and then another important part, the references. So these are the research, this is the research that the authors read before writing their paper. So it's a really good place if you want to find additional sources. If you're reading the intro and you're like, oh, that sounds like a good study that they discussed there. The reference should be in their reference list. So you can actually go and find that actual study and read that, add it to your reference list, those kinds of things. So with that being said, these are the sections of a research paper. The abstract is that summary of the whole article. The introduction is the introduction of why the author did the research and then what's the history of research in that area. Definitely read those, especially my 100 and 200 level classes, abstract and introduction. Definitely read those. Methodology, results, you can probably skip if you're in 100, 200 level classes. Methods is how did they do the study? What are their samples? Then results is what is the math? What are the stats of what happened? And the discussion, read that. So read the discussion, what the results mean and how it's related to the history of the research. And then the conclusion, what they learned, and you might be interested in some of the references. So for sure, for any of your article reading, read the abstract, read the introduction, read the discussion, and conclusion. So those are the main areas of a research article, how you should read it. You can kind of think of a research article as an hourglass. It starts kind of pretty broad with the whole summary and the introduction of the field, narrowing in at the end of the introduction on this is why we did this study. Then you've got the methods and results. This is our study. This is our stats. And then the discussion goes back wide. So based on these results, this is what we learned. This is why it matters to the field. And those bigger portions, the introduction, the discussion, those are some of the main things that you're going to want to learn from in your reading of research. So hopefully that was helpful and you now know a little bit better about how to take notes. You feel maybe a little more encouraged to take some handwritten notes and you know a little bit better of how to read a research article and what to take notes on in that. Again, the main idea is reread and try to put things into your own words as you're trying to understand these concepts. So good luck, have fun reading research.